The night had been painted in fire and smoke long before the SEALs realized they were cut off, trapped deep inside the valley with enemy fighters closing in from the ridges. It was supposed to be a clean extraction, a surgical strike to take out a weapons cache hidden in the mud brick compound that intelligence had confirmed only days before. The squad of 8 men had moved in under cover of darkness, their boots sinking in the fine dust of the high desert, their eyes scanning every shadow. The mission had gone flawlessly until the radios began to crackle with interference, until the world seemed to tilt and the valley erupted with gunfire. Lieutenant Harper, the team leader, had known at once that they were in trouble. The ridgelines glowed with the flash of muzzle fire, and the dirt around them spat upward as if the ground itself had turned against them. They pulled back into the ruins of an abandoned house, broken walls offering thin shelter against the storm. That was when Harper's call for extraction came back with words that froze every man to the bone. Air support was gone. The voice on the other end had been weary, almost apologetic, telling them all birds were diverted, all cover had been pulled, that they were on their own. The silence that followed was heavier than the incoming rounds. Every man felt it. Abandonment. Betrayal. The sudden weight of knowing they might not leave this valley alive. But SEALs were trained for hell, and Harper's men were not about to crumble. They checked ammunition, tightened their grips, and settled into defensive positions with the kind of grim resolve that only came from years of pushing past the edge. Sergeant Doyle, the heavy gunner, fed a belt into his weapon and laid down suppressing fire that rattled across the valley, sending sparks into the night. Rivers, the medic, patched up a bleeding shoulder without flinching as bullets cracked into the wall behind him. They spoke little, their communication reduced to short bursts of necessity, hand signals, nods, the kind of language only men who had lived and bled together understood. The enemy pressed closer, shadows darting between boulders, voices echoing across the rocks in a language the SEALs didn't understand but felt in their bones. Hours bled together, minutes stretched like lifetimes, and the ammo count fell lower and lower. When the first RPG slammed into the building, the blast shook their bones, showering them with dust and stone, ripping a hole in what little cover they had left. Harper's jaw tightened. He knew what it meant. They were being bracketed. It was only a matter of time before the compound was reduced to rubble, and with it, his men. Still, when his radio crackled again, he tried once more, voice hard as steel even though he expected nothing. "Command, this is Shadow 2 requesting immediate evac, requesting cover. We are pinned and low." Static, then silence. Then the same cold words, "Air support is gone." For a moment, Harper closed his eyes. He thought of his wife, his little girl back home, the photo folded in his chest pocket. He thought of the men around him, every one of them a brother bound by fire and blood. If this was the end, he would not let it be without a fight. "We hold," he said quietly, voice calm even as mortars began to drop closer. "No matter what, we hold." They answered not with words but with fire, unleashing what remained of their fury into the night. Doyle's gun roared, cutting down silhouettes on the ridge. Mason, the sniper, set up his rifle through a crack in the wall and dropped targets with mechanical precision. Even Rivers, his hands stained red from tending wounds, took up his rifle and squeezed off rounds. They fought like men possessed, like warriors from another age, each trigger pull a promise that they would not surrender. Yet deep inside each of them felt the creeping weight of reality. Ammunition doesn't last forever. Flesh breaks. Stone shatters. Time runs out. It was then, when the sky itself seemed indifferent to their struggle, that a distant thrum reached Harper's ears. At first he thought it was his imagination, the desperate trick of a mind searching for salvation in the chaos. But then the others heard it too, the low rhythmic chopping of rotor blades. Doyle looked up, eyes wide. Rivers actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. Mason whispered, "No way." The sound grew louder, sharper, until it became a roar that rolled across the valley. Against the backdrop of tracer fire and smoke, a silhouette emerged. A Black Hawk helicopter, its dark frame cutting through the night, descending low, straight into the teeth of enemy fire. Harper stared for a heartbeat, almost unable to believe it. Air support was gone. Command had abandoned them. But here it was, steel and salvation, defying orders or logic, plunging into the storm to reach them. The enemy must have seen it too, because the sky lit with fury. Tracer rounds stitched upward, red and green streaks trying to tear the bird from the heavens. RPGs whooshed from the ridges, streaking fire across the dark. The Black Hawk didn't flinch. Its miniguns opened up, spewing streams of lead that cut down swathes of enemy fighters, the noise deafening, the power overwhelming. It swept across the valley like an avenging angel, its door gunners firing with lethal precision, carving space for the SEALs to breathe. Harper felt adrenaline surge through his veins. Hope, sharp and blinding, stabbed through the exhaustion and despair. He slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle, shouted to his men. "That's our ride. Move, move." They didn't hesitate. They surged from the crumbling ruin into the open, bullets sparking at their feet, bodies low and fast as they sprinted toward the descending helicopter. The ground between them and the Black Hawk was a killing field, lit by muzzle flashes and explosions, but the SEALs tore across it with the desperation of men who knew salvation was only seconds away. Doyle covered their rear, his machine gun roaring until the barrels smoked, cutting down pursuers. Mason dropped enemies with shots so fast they blurred. Rivers half-carried another SEAL whose leg had been shredded by shrapnel, teeth clenched as he dragged him toward the bird. Harper was everywhere, shouting, firing, shoving his men forward, refusing to leave a single one behind. The Black Hawk hovered just above the dirt, its rotor wash whipping dust and debris into a furious storm. A door gunner leaned out, shouting, waving them in, while laying down fire that shredded the hillside. One by one the SEALs dove inside, bodies bruised and bleeding but alive. Harper was the last, hurling himself into the bay just as a rocket screamed past the tail, exploding in a fireball that rocked the bird. For a moment the helicopter bucked, alarms shrieking in the cockpit, but the pilot wrestled it back under control with the calm of a man who had walked through death before. Inside the cabin, the SEALs collapsed, sucking in breaths, their faces streaked with grime and blood but their eyes alive, blazing with the fire of survival. No one spoke at first, the roar of engines and the pounding of their own hearts filling the silence. Finally Rivers laughed again, shaking his head. "Air support was gone, huh?" His voice cracked, half disbelieving, half exultant. Doyle let out a ragged chuckle. Mason just grinned through the sweat. Harper looked at them all, then at the pilot in the cockpit, shadowed figure who had brought them back from the edge. He didn't know who had sent the Black Hawk or why, but in that moment none of it mattered. What mattered was that his men were alive, torn from the jaws of death by a defiant machine and the men who flew it straight into hell. Outside, the valley still burned, enemy fighters still screamed, but the SEALs were airborne, rising above the fire. The Black Hawk clawed its way upward through the choking haze of smoke and tracer fire, the pilots pushing the engines to their limits as enemy rounds pinged against the armor and hissed past the open doors. Inside the cabin, the SEALs gripped their rifles tightly, adrenaline still burning through their veins, every man riding that thin line between exhaustion and the raw high of survival. The wounded moaned softly, Rivers working frantically to stabilize them, his hands moving with automatic precision even as the helicopter lurched violently to avoid another incoming rocket. Harper moved toward the cockpit, bracing himself against the vibrating frame as he leaned closer to the pilot. He wanted to see the face of the man who had pulled off the impossible, the man who had ignored orders or defied command to bring his team out of hell. But the pilot's helmet and visor hid most of his expression, only the hard line of his jaw visible beneath the glow of the instrument panel. The co-pilot glanced back, voice sharp over the roar. "We're not clear yet. Strap in, this is going to be rough." As if on cue, the valley walls erupted with more gunfire, muzzle flashes stuttering across the ridges like fireflies of death. The helicopter banked sharply, side-slipping through the canyon with a speed that made stomachs lurch. Harper dropped into a seat, slamming his harness shut, while Doyle and Mason returned fire out the open door, laying down bursts that kept the pursuing fighters' heads down. The door gunners never stopped, their weapons spitting out ribbons of light that stitched across the darkness. Still, the enemy was relentless. RPGs streaked dangerously close, explosions buffeting the helicopter with brutal waves of force. The pilot's hands danced across the controls, weaving the Black Hawk through the gauntlet, pulling maneuvers that seemed to defy physics, the rotors chopping at the night as though carving a path through sheer will. Harper realized then that whoever this man was, he wasn't just skilled, he was extraordinary. A ghost who had appeared from nowhere to carry them through fire. Minutes stretched into eternities as the Black Hawk fought its way out of the valley, and still the enemy poured fire at them, unwilling to let the Americans slip away. The ridges finally began to drop back, the open sky widening around them, but even as Harper felt the first breath of relief, a missile lock warning shrieked in the cockpit. The pilot cursed, the helicopter jerking violently into a dive that pressed every man into his harness. The missile streaked overhead, missing by feet, exploding in a fiery bloom that rattled their bones. Another lock warning followed almost immediately. This time the co-pilot popped flares, streaks of burning light arcing across the sky, and the missile veered off, confused, detonating harmlessly in the dark. The SEALs clenched their teeth, gripping anything they could as the Black Hawk clawed upward again, rotors screaming, the sound nearly drowned out by the pounding in their ears. Through it all, the pilot's voice was steady, calm, commanding, calling out maneuvers and countermeasures as if chaos itself bent to his will. Finally, after what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, the Black Hawk broke free of the valley's grasp. The mountains fell behind, the gunfire diminished into echoes, and the sky ahead stretched vast and empty. Inside the cabin, the men sagged against their harnesses, every muscle trembling from the adrenaline crash. Rivers finished bandaging the wounded man's leg, his hands stained but steady, then leaned back with a weary sigh. Doyle reloaded his machine gun with shaking fingers, more out of habit than necessity, muttering curses about how close it had been. Mason simply leaned his head back, eyes closed, though Harper knew he wasn't asleep, just letting the storm inside settle. Harper himself stayed upright, gaze locked on the cockpit, on the shadowed figure flying them to safety. There was a story there, something unspoken, and Harper intended to learn it. They flew for nearly an hour before the Black Hawk finally descended onto a makeshift forward operating base, its floodlights stabbing into the night as soldiers on the ground scrambled to receive them. The helicopter touched down hard, its skids hitting the dirt with a bone-jarring impact, the rotors still whipping dust into a violent storm. The SEALs disembarked quickly, Rivers and another soldier lifting the wounded out on a stretcher, Doyle and Mason covering their flanks even though the danger was behind them now. Harper was the last to step off, his boots sinking into the dirt, and he turned just in time to see the pilot remove his helmet. The face revealed was lean, weathered, marked with the kind of hard edges that only years of combat could carve. His eyes were sharp, steady, carrying the calm of a man who had walked through hell more times than he could count. Harper approached, nodding once. "You weren't supposed to be there," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. The pilot smirked faintly, shaking his head. "Yeah, that's what they told me too." Before Harper could press further, officers swarmed in, medics rushing to treat the wounded, ground crews moving to refuel the helicopter. The base buzzed with controlled chaos, but beneath it Harper felt an undercurrent, a tension that wasn't visible yet but hummed like a wire pulled too tight. His men had been left to die in that valley. Someone had pulled air support, someone had made a decision to abandon them, and then this pilot had defied it. That truth gnawed at Harper's gut, even as he moved among his men, clapping shoulders, exchanging brief words of reassurance. They had survived, yes, but the unanswered questions burned almost hotter than the gunfire they had escaped. Why had command written them off? Who had given the order? And who exactly was the pilot who had ignored it? Later, when the medics had taken the wounded away and the base quieted to its nocturnal rhythm, Harper found himself standing near the edge of the tarmac, watching the Black Hawk crew conduct post-flight checks. The pilot noticed him, walking over with the easy gait of a man unshaken by danger. "Lieutenant," he greeted, his voice carrying no weight of rank, just familiarity. Harper studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You went against orders tonight." The pilot's eyes narrowed slightly, though the smirk lingered. "Sometimes orders are wrong." Harper let the words hang in the night air. He couldn't deny the truth of them. His men were alive because someone had chosen to break the chain of command, because someone had chosen to believe that leaving no man behind wasn't just a phrase but a promise. Still, Harper knew there would be consequences. Defiance didn't go unnoticed in the military, and whoever this man was, he had just painted a target on his back. The pilot extended a hand then, firm and steady. Harper took it, the grip solid, the kind that spoke louder than words. "Name's Rourke," the pilot said simply. "Captain Rourke. You and your men fought like hell tonight. Glad I could help finish the job." Harper nodded once, holding his gaze. "We don't forget things like this." Rourke only shrugged, his eyes glinting with something unreadable, then turned back toward his crew, leaving Harper standing in the dust with more questions than answers. The night stretched on around them, quiet now, but the echoes of battle still rang in every man's bones. They had been saved from death, but Harper sensed this was only the beginning, that the valley, the betrayal, and the Black Hawk that defied orders were part of something larger, something that would follow them into the next mission and the one after that. Sleep didn't come easy for the SEALs that night. Even though they were back at the forward operating base, behind walls and under the protection of friendlies, their nerves were still tuned to the chaos of the valley. Every slam of a metal door, every echoing footstep in the night carried them back to the smell of cordite and the scream of incoming rockets. Harper lay on his cot staring at the ceiling, his rifle within reach as always, his body aching but his mind refusing to settle. He thought of his men, of Rivers sitting beside the wounded SEAL in the infirmary, of Doyle probably pacing like a caged animal, of Mason cleaning his rifle with that cold precision of his. He thought of Rourke most of all, the pilot who had dragged them out of hell when everyone else said it was impossible. Harper knew courage when he saw it, but Rourke's actions hadn't been just bravery, they had been rebellion. And rebellion in the military always came with a cost. Harper closed his eyes, but even then he could still see the tracer fire dancing in the valley, the way hope had almost died before the thrum of rotor blades brought it back to life. At dawn, Harper gathered his men in the mess hall. Their faces were drawn, some still streaked with the grime of the night before, but they were alive. Doyle wolfed down rations as if he hadn't eaten in days, while Mason sat quietly, his eyes scanning the room out of habit. Rivers looked exhausted, his hands still trembling from the endless hours of patching wounds. Harper stood at the end of the table, his coffee cooling in his hand. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. Every eye turned toward him. "We were left to die in that valley. That wasn't just bad luck or bad timing. That was a decision. Somebody pulled support knowing we were still on the ground." Silence settled across the table like a heavy blanket. Doyle swore under his breath. Rivers looked down at his tray. Mason finally spoke, his voice flat. "So what's the play, boss?" Harper let the question hang before answering. "First, we keep our eyes open. Second, we figure out who's pulling the strings. And third," he paused, his jaw tightening, "we make sure it doesn't happen again." As if summoned by the words, Rourke appeared in the doorway. He carried the same easy presence, his uniform still dust-stained, his eyes steady but sharp. He stepped inside, nodding at the men as if he belonged among them. Harper gestured for him to join, and Rourke slid into the seat at the table without hesitation. Doyle grunted. "So, Captain, you always enjoy playing guardian angel, or was last night just for show?" Rourke smirked faintly, unbothered by the edge in Doyle's voice. "You looked like you needed the lift." Mason studied him carefully. "Command told us we were cut off. Said no birds were coming. You show up anyway. Doesn't add up." Rourke met his gaze evenly. "Doesn't have to add up. Sometimes you do what's right even if nobody told you to." His tone carried no arrogance, only conviction, and for a moment the room was quiet except for the clatter of utensils. Harper leaned forward. "You knew what it would cost you, going against orders." Rourke didn't flinch. "Yeah, I knew. Still worth it." His eyes shifted, scanning each of the SEALs. "You've all been on missions where command saw the bigger picture and decided you were expendable. I wasn't about to let that happen again, not on my watch." Rivers finally spoke up, his voice tired but sincere. "If you hadn't come, we'd all be in body bags right now. I don't care what the brass thinks. You did the only thing that mattered." Doyle grumbled agreement, Mason gave a curt nod. Harper felt the same fire stir in his chest that he had felt when he first heard the chopper blades. Rourke had risked everything, not for glory, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. That kind of loyalty was rare, and Harper knew it was worth remembering. Later that morning, Harper was summoned to the command tent. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and sweat, the hum of generators rattling through the canvas walls. A colonel sat behind a folding table stacked with maps and reports, his expression hard. "Lieutenant Harper," he began without pleasantries, "your team returned last night under circumstances that raise questions." Harper stood at attention, keeping his face neutral. "We completed the mission. We're alive. I'd call that a success." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "You were not supposed to receive extraction. Air support was diverted to a higher priority operation. Yet somehow a Black Hawk crew disobeyed direct orders and pulled you out. Do you have an explanation for that?" Harper held his gaze steadily. "I don't, sir. I was too busy keeping my men alive." The colonel studied him, the silence stretching. "Be careful, Lieutenant. Sometimes surviving creates more problems than dying." Harper left the tent with his jaw tight, the words ringing in his ears. Someone high up had decided they were expendable, and now someone else was angry that Rourke had refused to play along. That night, Harper found Rourke again, this time near the hangars where the Black Hawk was being refueled. The two men stood under the dim glow of floodlights, the night air cool against their faces. Harper didn't waste time. "They're coming for you," he said quietly. Rourke chuckled dryly. "Wouldn't be the first time." Harper stepped closer. "You need to understand, whoever pulled support, they wanted us gone. Dead. And you screwed that up for them. That makes you a problem now. They'll bury you if they can." Rourke's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "Then let them try." There was no fear in his voice, no hesitation, only a defiance that mirrored the flight through the valley. Harper respected it, but he also knew defiance had limits. The military was a machine, and machines didn't like gears that spun the wrong way. The days that followed were tense. The SEALs trained, patrolled, maintained their weapons, but the unease lingered. Whispers moved through the base like smoke, about missions cut short, about soldiers written off, about command making choices that didn't sit right with the men on the ground. Harper watched his team closely, saw the way Doyle's temper flared quicker, the way Rivers grew quieter, the way Mason became even more observant, his eyes always scanning as if waiting for betrayal. Rourke kept flying missions, his Black Hawk carving through the skies with the same fearless precision, but Harper noticed how the brass avoided him, how conversation stopped when he entered the room, how paperwork seemed to pile up with his name on it. It was only a matter of time before something snapped. One evening, while Harper was cleaning his rifle in the barracks, Mason entered silently, closing the door behind him. "Boss," he said, voice low, "you should know, word is they're planning to ground Rourke. Strip him of his flight status. Maybe worse." Harper set the rifle down, his jaw tightening. "On what grounds?" Mason shrugged. "Disobedience. Insubordination. Whatever word makes it sound cleaner." Harper felt the slow burn of anger in his chest. Rourke had saved them all, and now the system wanted to erase him. But Harper also knew anger wasn't enough. If they wanted to protect Rourke, they would need more than words, they would need proof. Proof of who had given the order to abandon them, proof of why. Without it, they would all be swallowed by the machine. The barracks felt colder that night, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of betrayal. Harper sat on the edge of his cot, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor as Mason's words echoed in his head. They were planning to ground Rourke. Maybe worse. That was how the machine worked, cut out the problem before it grew into something larger. But this wasn't just about Rourke. Harper knew deep down that what had happened in the valley wasn't an isolated decision. Someone higher up had decided their team was expendable. Someone had weighed lives against strategy and chosen to let them bleed out in the dirt. The thought burned hotter than any firefight. Harper clenched his fists, his mind running through possibilities. The colonel had hinted as much in the command tent, but Harper suspected the strings were being pulled from far above his pay grade. He glanced around the room. Doyle was already asleep, snoring lightly, his exhaustion catching up with him. Rivers was in the infirmary, refusing to leave the wounded man's side. Mason sat by the window, his rifle across his lap, silent but watchful. Harper stood and crossed the room to him. "We can't let this go," he said quietly. Mason didn't look away from the window, his voice low and certain. "I wasn't planning to." The next morning, Harper approached Rourke near the hangars again. The pilot looked like he hadn't slept, his uniform still wrinkled, his eyes shadowed but alert. "They're moving against you," Harper said, wasting no time. Rourke gave a humorless chuckle. "Let me guess, paperwork, disciplinary hearings, maybe a transfer to somewhere they don't need pilots." Harper's jaw tightened. "Or worse, they'll make an example out of you. And if they can bury you, they'll bury what happened to us." Rourke studied him for a long moment, then said, "So what do you want to do?" Harper lowered his voice, his eyes scanning the area to make sure they weren't overheard. "We find out who pulled that order. We get proof. If we can expose it, they can't touch you, and they won't try this with another team again." Rourke leaned against the chopper, folding his arms, his expression unreadable. "You're talking about going against command, Lieutenant. That's a dangerous game." Harper met his gaze steadily. "Dangerous doesn't scare me. Being used as pawns does." That night, the SEALs gathered in a quiet corner of the base, away from the patrol lights and watchful eyes. Doyle was furious, pacing back and forth, his fists clenched. "So that's it? They just decided we weren't worth it? They were ready to leave us to rot in that valley?" Rivers, tired and pale, nodded grimly. "That's what it looks like." Mason remained calm, his tone precise. "If we're going after proof, we need to know where to look. Orders like that don't vanish. There'll be records, communications logs, flight directives, something." Harper looked at each of them in turn. "This isn't about revenge. It's about survival. If they can cut us loose once, they can do it again. And next time, maybe we won't be so lucky." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled in. Doyle finally stopped pacing, his eyes hard. "Then let's dig." The opportunity came sooner than expected. Mason, with his sharp eyes and quiet ways, had managed to overhear a conversation near the command tent. Two officers speaking in hushed tones about reallocating resources and acceptable losses. It was the language of people who thought in numbers, not lives. Mason related to the team, his voice cold. They're covering their tracks. If we wait too long, whatever evidence there is will vanish. Harper nodded. Then we move fast. The plan was simple but risky: slip into the operations tent after hours, pull whatever logs and files they could find, and get out before anyone noticed. Rourke offered to help, his access as a pilot giving him an edge. Together they formed a plan. It wasn't a mission sanctioned by command, but Harper felt the same fire in his chest as he had on countless raids. Only this time the enemy wore the same uniform. Under the cover of darkness they moved. The base was quieter at night, though patrols still circled and floodlights swept the yard. Harper led them, his steps silent, his senses sharp. Mason ghosted behind him, Rivers carrying a small pack of medical supplies that doubled as tools for breaking locks, Doyle bringing up the rear like a restless predator. Rourke guided them toward the operations tent, his familiarity with the layout invaluable. The tent loomed ahead, its canvas walls glowing faintly from the light inside. A single guard stood nearby, bored and inattentive, his rifle slung loosely. Mason slipped forward, a shadow in the dark, and moments later the guard was unconscious on the ground, breathing steadily but out cold. They moved inside quickly, the scent of paper, ink and electronics filling the air. Inside, rows of tables held maps, reports, radios and computers. Mason immediately went to work, rifling through folders with practiced efficiency. Rivers accessed a terminal, his fingers moving clumsily but determinedly across the keyboard. Doyle stood watch by the entrance, his weapon ready. Harper scanned the room until his eyes fell on a stack of folders marked Operations Reallocation. He flipped one open, his breath catching as he read. The words were dry, clinical, but the meaning was sharp enough to cut. Mission Shadow 2. Resources redirected. Priority reallocation authorized. Casualty risk deemed acceptable. The authorizing signature at the bottom made his stomach twist. It wasn't just some low-level officer. It was a general. Harper shoved the papers into his pack, his hands shaking with a mix of anger and grim satisfaction. "We've got it," he whispered. "This is the proof." But even as the words left his mouth, the sound of boots outside made Doyle tense. "Company," he muttered. The SEALs froze, listening as voices approached. The tent flaps stirred, and Harper made a snap decision. "Out the back," he hissed. They slipped through a cut in the canvas, melting into the shadows just as two officers entered through the front. Hearts pounding, they crept along the side of the tent, hugging the shadows, moving silently until they reached the perimeter. Mason checked the path, signaled clear, and they slipped back into the night, their prize secure. When they regrouped at the barracks, Harper laid the papers out on the table. His men stared at the cold words, the blunt admission that their lives had been gambled and nearly lost. Doyle cursed again, slamming a fist into the table. Rivers looked sick. Mason's jaw was clenched tight. Rourke studied the pages in silence, then looked at Harper. "Now you know. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Harper didn't answer right away. He looked at his men, at the faces of those who had followed him into hell and back, at Rourke, who had risked everything to save them. He thought of the general's signature, the weight of betrayal behind it, and the machine that had already started moving to erase it all. Slowly, Harper folded the papers and slipped them back into his pack. His voice was calm but hard as steel when he finally spoke. "We're not going to let them bury this. If they think we're expendable, they're going to learn how wrong they are." His men nodded, one by one, silent vows passing between them. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Under the jagged cliffs that loomed like silent sentinels over the barren valley, the SEALs had dug into shallow cover, the dust from the last firefight still clinging to their faces, mixing with sweat and the grime of survival. Hours had dragged by since the ambush that shredded their original plan, and the men were running on nothing but adrenaline and the sheer stubborn refusal to die in the middle of nowhere. The radio operator had tried twice more to call for air support, his voice low but steady, though each attempt came back with the same static-heavy confirmation. "Negative. Air support is gone. You're on your own." The words still echoed in their heads like a curse, but none of them spoke it aloud because acknowledging it meant leaning into despair. And despair was a death sentence in that valley. Their ammo was low, water was scarce, and one of their own, Petty Officer Torres, had taken a bullet through the thigh that left him pale and trembling, though he bit down on every groan so his brothers could focus on the fight. Chief Maddox crouched by him, eyes scanning the jagged ridges where enemy fighters prowled like wolves, waiting for another opportunity to strike. The silence between bursts of gunfire was not peace, it was a predator stalking its prey, a quiet so thick that even the wind seemed to hesitate before moving. The men exchanged glances, unspoken communication born of years of trust, every twitch of an eyebrow or clench of a jaw speaking volumes about the odds they faced. They had been trained for situations exactly like this, yet training never accounted for the suffocating loneliness of being cut off, betrayed by the promise of support that had evaporated into nothing but empty static. Somewhere deep in the valley the enemy regrouped, their voices carrying faintly over the rocks, the language foreign but the intent unmistakable. They meant to finish this, to bury the SEALs beneath stone and dust. Time stretched, every minute a slow drip of tension that scraped the nerves raw. Maddox finally signaled for a shift in position, crawling across the dust to a better vantage point overlooking the narrow path where the enemy would likely approach. His men followed, bodies pressed to the earth like shadows, every motion careful, deliberate, as though the valley itself might wake and crush them. Torres was dragged along on a makeshift litter cobbled together from webbing and shattered branches, his teeth clenched so tight the muscles in his jaw trembled. They had reached a shallow depression in the ground that offered partial cover when the first crack of a rifle split the silence, a round snapping just inches from Maddox's head. In an instant the valley roared to life, rifles barking from the ridges, tracer rounds hissing through the air, rocks exploding into shards as bullets struck. The SEALs returned fire, their discipline holding even as adrenaline surged, each man firing in controlled bursts, their weapons an extension of will. Maddox barked orders that were barely audible over the cacophony, repositioning his men to cover angles, shifting fire like a conductor shaping chaos into desperate survival. Rounds slammed into the earth around them, and one tore through the litter carrying Torres, nearly flipping him onto the dirt, but his brothers yanked him back into cover, refusing to let him be taken. Dust and smoke mingled in the air, choking the lungs, but the SEALs fought on, their training the only anchor against the storm pressing in from all sides. Then, as if the valley itself wanted to break them, a distant rumble joined the chorus, the grinding, gut-dropping sound of enemy vehicles crawling toward them, armored trucks with mounted guns, their outlines just visible through the heat haze. The SEALs glanced at one another, the grim recognition settling in that this was not a fight they were meant to walk away from. Still, not one of them considered surrender, it was not in their blood. They adjusted positions, redistributed their meager ammunition, and prepared to bleed the enemy dry even if it meant their own end. It was in that moment, as death pressed closest, that a faint vibration touched the earth beneath their bodies, a rhythm out of place in the chaos of rifles and trucks. At first Maddox thought it was artillery, his mind already calculating how many seconds they had until the first shell dropped. But then the vibration grew into a pounding thrum that every soldier in the valley recognized, the heavy chop of rotor blades cutting through the air. Heads snapped upward, eyes wide, hearts hammering with disbelief. The sound grew louder, closer, a hammer beating against the sky, until the unmistakable silhouette of a Black Hawk helicopter burst into view, cresting the ridgeline with its rotors sending dust spiraling into the air. For a heartbeat, no one moved, not SEAL, not enemy, as the bird descended through enemy fire, its fuselage glinting in the dying light of the sun. Then the valley erupted, enemy gunners turned their weapons skyward, streaks of tracer fire arcing up to meet the helicopter, bullets clanging against its armored skin, sparks scattering like fireflies. The Black Hawk pressed on, undeterred, its side gunners unleashing a storm of fire that ripped into the ridges, shredding enemy positions and buying the SEALs precious seconds of breath. Maddox shouted to his men, his voice rising above the roar, rallying them to push forward under the bird's cover. The Black Hawk descended like a guardian angel born of steel and defiance, its rotors churning up walls of dust that blinded the enemy and cloaked the SEALs in a veil of chaos. One gunner leaned half out of the open side door, his weapon spewing fire as he swept the ridges, forcing the insurgents to scatter like startled insects. The pilot wove the craft with impossible precision, dodging streams of tracer fire, banking low, tilting just enough to shield the SEALs' advance. Maddox felt his chest tighten with a surge of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in hours: hope. He roared to his men and they surged forward, dragging Torres, firing as they moved, sprinting toward the rising maelstrom where salvation hovered. Enemy fighters broke cover, screaming as they fired wildly, desperate to cut down the Americans before they reached the bird. The SEALs cut them down with icy precision, every shot fueled by the knowledge that a miracle had just descended into their valley of death. The Black Hawk landed hard, its skids slamming into the dirt, its engine screaming against the strain of enemy fire. Bullets sparked against its hull, a windshield spiderwebbed with cracks, but still it stood, its crew refusing to lift off until their brothers were aboard. Maddox and his men dove into the dust storm, shielding Torres with their bodies as they closed the distance, every second an eternity as enemy fire chewed at the ground around them. And above it all, the Black Hawk thundered, a defiant heartbeat against the valley that had sworn to be their grave. The Black Hawk skid slammed into the dirt with a bone-rattling impact, its rotors tearing the valley into a cyclone of dust and debris, the sound so deafening it felt like the air itself was breaking apart. But the SEALs didn't hesitate, they moved as one, dragging Torres between them as bullets hissed and cracked through the storm, sparks bouncing off the helicopter's armored frame while the door gunners poured fire into the ridgelines, cutting down fighters who were sprinting forward in a desperate bid to overwhelm the rescue attempt, every second stretching into eternity as Maddox barked orders to keep the formation tight, to keep their wounded shielded, to keep moving no matter what because the Black Hawk wasn't going to wait forever and the valley wasn't going to forgive hesitation. So they ran, stumbling through the swirling dust, ears ringing, lungs burning, the world collapsing into the singular objective of reaching the bird that had dared to descend into hell for them. Rounds snapped around them, one striking the dirt so close that shards of rock slashed across Maddox's face, hot lines of pain he ignored as he shoved Torres's litter forward, his men firing in disciplined bursts that answered the chaos with precision, and for every enemy that appeared through the dust, another fell, their advance slowed but not stopped, because the valley seemed endless with fighters, pouring from cracks and shadows like the land itself wanted blood, yet above it all the Black Hawk thundered, refusing to yield, its pilot dancing the machine across the ground to shield the SEAL's path, tilting dangerously low to rake the cliffs with suppressive fire, rotors nearly brushing stone as tracers arced up to meet it, some striking home with a clang that sent vibrations through the frame but never breaking the rhythm of its pounding blades. The men reached the first side door, shoving Torres up with raw strength as the crew grabbed him, pulling him into the belly of the beast while Maddox and two others turned their backs to the hatch, rifles steady, cutting down figures that lunged from the haze, the muzzle flashes strobing against the storm until the gun barrels seared their hands, but still they fired, still they pushed until the last man was hauled inside, boots slipping against the metal deck slick with sweat and dust as the door slammed shut. Inside the Black Hawk the noise was worse, the roar of the rotors mingling with the scream of engines and the relentless hammer of enemy fire striking metal, rattling through their bones as the crew shouted over headsets, the pilot demanding more altitude, the gunners cursing as they reloaded belts with trembling hands, and the SEALs collapsed for only a heartbeat before instinct took over, Maddox dragging himself to Torres to check the bleeding, pressing harder against the wound as his teammate groaned, while another SEAL passed ammo belts forward to the gunners without needing to be asked, because inside that bird there was no division between crew and passengers, only soldiers fighting to stay alive together. The helicopter lurched, banking hard left as a stream of tracers stitched the air where it had been a second earlier, throwing men against the bulkhead, rattling rifles and gear across the deck, but the pilot yanked it back level, climbing hard even as alarms screamed in the cockpit, warning of engine strain and incoming fire. Through the side window Maddox caught flashes of the ridges peeling away beneath them, dark figures scrambling to higher ground with launchers on their shoulders, and his stomach clenched because rifles couldn't stop what was coming next, but the gunners were already screaming warnings, swiveling barrels, opening up with everything they had to keep the launchers from locking on, brass shells spilling across the deck in golden rivers as they spat fury into the cliffs, explosions blooming where fighters were caught mid-aim, their weapons shattering before they could unleash death. Still, one rocket fired, streaking through the dust with a trail of smoke that made every man on board hold his breath, the pilot jerking the bird into a stomach-dropping dive at the last second, the rocket passing so close its heat rattled through the fuselage before it detonated harmlessly in the sky above, a burst of flame that briefly illuminated the madness below. The SEALs clung to straps and each other, their world a violent blur of metal and motion, but not one of them spoke of fear because there was no time for it, only the next second, the next movement, survival carved into every thought. The bird clawed higher, engines howling, but the valley wasn't finished with them yet. From the far side, headlights flared as enemy vehicles roared into position, heavy machine guns mounted, barrels tilting upward to spit fury into the night sky, and the Black Hawk shuddered as rounds peppered its frame, some punching small holes through the cabin that whistled with air, the crew shouting damage reports but refusing to falter, the gunners leaning out into the storm, answering with fire that lit the cliffs with infernos, turning stone to shrapnel as enemy positions were ripped apart. Maddox felt the deck tremble beneath his knees, the wounded moaning in pain, the world reduced to the raw struggle of machine against gravity, of men against the endless tide of enemies, until finally the helicopter broke free of the valley, the cliffs falling away behind them like the closing jaws of a beast that had failed to bite. For the first time in hours the open sky spread before them, wide and endless, but even that freedom was fragile because the Black Hawk was bleeding, fuel lines nicked, rotors whining under strain, alarms still screaming in the cockpit. Inside the bird, silence finally edged its way between the crashes of gunfire, not peace but exhaustion, the men leaning against the bulkheads, breathing hard, sweat dripping in rivers down their faces as their bodies shook with adrenaline's collapse, though none let themselves fully relax because they knew the fight wasn't over, not while they were still in enemy territory, not while every hilltop could hide another launcher or gun waiting for them. Maddox pressed tighter against Torres's wound, whispering rough encouragement into his ear, words drowned by the roar of the engines but felt all the same, while across from him another SEAL rechecked his rifle, counting the last few rounds left in his magazine, preparing for the possibility they might be called to fight again before the night was over. The crew chief moved down the line, clapping shoulders, shouting above the noise that they were not safe yet, that the bird was hurting, but they had a heading, they had distance, and as long as the rotors turned they still had a chance. The valley was behind them but pursuit was inevitable, and every man aboard knew it, the Black Hawk pushing forward into the uncertain darkness, the pilot's face tight with concentration as he threaded the wounded machine through the mountains, searching for cover, for distance, for a route home, while the SEALs leaned back into the metal, eyes closed for a heartbeat but rifles still cradled across their chests, the weight of survival pressing down heavy but not crushing, not yet, because they were still alive, still together, and somewhere ahead lay the faintest chance of extraction, of survival, of waking tomorrow to remember the day the bird came for them when all hope was gone. The Black Hawk carved through the night sky like a wounded predator, its rotors screaming with strain, the battered fuselage rattling with every gust of mountain wind, alarms flashing red across the cockpit as the pilot fought to keep the bird steady, but inside the cabin no one complained, no one panicked, because the SEALs had lived too long on the edge of death to give voice to fear now. They simply braced against the vibrating metal walls, rifles clutched tight, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the doors where tracer rounds might leap at any second there. Breaths ragged but controlled, the sound mingling with the deep mechanical heartbeat of the helicopter, and even through the exhaustion their minds ticked, calculating, preparing, refusing to believe that escape was already secure because they knew better, they knew the enemy wasn't finished yet. Maddox crouched beside Torres, checking the makeshift bandage again, his hands slick with blood that refused to stop no matter how much pressure he applied, but the wounded SEAL's eyes still burned with a feral light, jaw clenched, refusing to slip into the darkness clawing at the edges of his vision, and Maddox leaned close, growling encouragement through clenched teeth, telling him to hold on, to remember who he was, because this bird wasn't going down and neither was he. The crew chief moved down the line, sweat streaked across his face despite the night air, shouting that they had 30 minutes of fuel if the leaks held, maybe less if another round had clipped a line, and the men absorbed the news without flinching, simply adjusting grips on their weapons, because 30 minutes was 30 lifetimes in combat, and every one of them intended to fight for each second if it came to that. The mountains rolled beneath them in jagged shadows, peaks rising like blackened teeth against the star-scattered sky, valleys yawning like hungry mouths below, and Maddox felt the instinctive prickle at the back of his neck that said the fight wasn't behind them, not completely, and sure enough a voice cracked over the crew's headset, the co-pilot shouting about heat signatures closing fast from the east, enemy technicals bouncing across the ridgelines, their mounted guns already spitting fire. Into the night, the tracer arcs beautiful in their lethality as they clawed upward toward the fleeing bird. The gunners didn't wait for orders, they swung their barrels out, sending streams of lead down into the dark, flashes lighting the ridges like a strobe, rock exploding, figures tumbling, but the trucks kept coming, their engines howling as they pursued, undeterred by the death raining down, their gunners raking the sky with fury. The helicopter shuddered as rounds peppered its tail, alarms wailing louder, the pilot cursing as he yanked the bird into a desperate climb, rotors whining in protest, the strain visible in every tremor of the frame, but still the Black Hawk clawed for altitude, trying to put distance between itself and the teeth snapping at its heels. Inside, the SEALs braced themselves against the deck, the sharp tilt sending loose brass skittering like marbles, their muscles screaming from exhaustion but their eyes alive, watching, waiting, because survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about recognizing the moment when endurance had to become action. The co-pilot shouted another warning, this one worse, the kind of word that made hearts lurch, man pads, and Maddox's eyes snapped to the ridges in time to see the faint flare of a launch, a streak of smoke and fire slicing the night, a heat-seeking missile tearing toward them with the hunger of inevitability. The pilot didn't hesitate, he slammed the bird into a dive that turned stomachs upside down, the world outside spinning, the mountains lurching closer in a terrifying rush, while the crew chief triggered countermeasures, flares shooting from the Black Hawk in blazing trails that lit the sky like falling stars, and for a heartbeat Maddox thought they'd bought salvation, but the missile veered, hunting, correcting, closing the gap with merciless intent. Shouts filled the cabin, men gripping whatever they could, the wounded groaning as the bird heaved violently, and then the missile struck one of the flares, exploding just short of the tail in a fireball that rocked the helicopter like a hammer blow, shrapnel peppering the fuselage, sparks cascading inside as panels rattled loose, but by some miracle the rotors still turned, the engine still screamed, and the bird still lived. The crew erupted into cheers that were half defiance, half disbelief, but Maddox didn't celebrate, he simply pressed harder on Torres's wound, jaw clenched, because he knew another missile could already be waiting. The bird steadied, wobbling but alive, and the gunners leaned out once more, shredding the ridges with fury to keep the enemy suppressed, the barrels glowing red-hot, smoke coiling from the muzzles, brass raining like waterfalls into the void below, while the SEALs inside prepared for the possibility that escape meant another firefight, their weapons checked, magazines counted, grenades unclipped and ready to be hurled into the abyss if boarding was attempted. The pilot banked hard west, angling for a narrow canyon that offered cover but demanded precision, threading the helicopter between sheer walls of stone where a single mistake meant fiery death, but he took it anyway, because the open sky was suicide and the canyon was their only shield. The Black Hawk slipped into the dark throat of the canyon, rotors thumping so close to the rock that dust rained down in choking clouds, and for a few blessed moments the gunfire above lessened, the pursuing trucks forced to halt at the rim, their guns unable to angle down into the twisting maze. But even in that fleeting reprieve there was no comfort, only the knowledge that they had traded one danger for another, because the canyon was a trap as much as it was shelter, and every man on board knew it. Inside, time seemed suspended, the SEALs' breaths loud in the confined space, the gunners scanning the ridges through night vision lenses, fingers twitching on triggers, and Maddox finally allowed his mind to drift for a heartbeat, not to rest but to steel itself, remembering every lesson drilled into him, every fight survived, every brother buried, because survival wasn't luck, it was will, and his will had not broken yet. Torres's breathing was shallow but steady, his hand gripping Maddox's wrist in a silent promise that he wasn't letting go, not yet, and Maddox squeezed back with a ferocity born of everything they had endured together. The bird shook again, turbulence throwing sparks from loose wiring, the crew chief moving fast to secure it, shouting reassurance that the engines were holding for now, that the fuel would last if the leak stayed small, but his eyes betrayed the truth, they were running on borrowed time. The canyon twisted again, the pilot guiding the helicopter with surgical precision, banking through blind turns where cliffs scraped past close enough to touch, every moment a gamble, until finally the walls began to widen, the stars bleeding back into view, and with them the distant shimmer of something more, friendly territory, maybe, or at least a horizon that wasn't owned entirely by death. Yet before relief could take root, the radio crackled, garbled voices breaking through the static, the kind of sound that carried both danger and salvation. A forward operating base answering at last, coordinates traded in a rush, a landing zone promised if they could hold out just a little longer, and the men shared grim smiles because a little longer was all they'd ever asked for, another second, another breath, another chance to fight their way home. Maddox leaned back against the vibrating hull, eyes closed for a heartbeat, then opened them again, sharper than ever, because the fight wasn't over, the valley wasn't finished, and the bird wasn't safe, but for the first time since the world had collapsed around them, there was something ahead worth clawing toward, and every man aboard the Black Hawk felt it. Hope sharpened into defiance, defiance sharpened into survival, and survival sharpened into the iron promise that none of them were ready to die tonight. The Black Hawk clawed through the night, its rotors hammering the thin mountain air like a heartbeat that refused to stop, the cabin alive with the metallic rattle of strained machinery and the hushed breaths of men who knew their lives were hanging by the barest thread. And though the stars stretched cold and endless above them, the darkness below was not finished yet, because the enemy was not the kind to let prey slip away so easily. They were hunters born of this land, and they would chase until blood was spilled, theirs or the SEALs. Maddox sat braced against the vibrating hull, one arm clamped tight on Torres's bandaged thigh to slow the bleeding, his other hand gripping the handle above him as the bird jolted with every sudden maneuver, his eyes never leaving the jagged horizon where salvation was supposed to wait. And every other man aboard mirrored that same expression of exhaustion welded to iron determination, faces drawn but eyes blazing, because survival wasn't just instinct, it was defiance. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, clipped and strained, warning of dwindling fuel and a damaged tail rotor, telling them they had one chance at the forward operating base 5 clicks ahead, a patch of dirt lit with infrared strobes invisible to the enemy, but to reach it they'd have to cross open ground, a stretch of sky where there would be no cover, no canyon walls to shield them, only the hope that the bird could hold together long enough and that the guns on the ground couldn't bring them down before the finish line. The SEALs didn't flinch at the warning, they simply adjusted their grips on their rifles, checked their remaining magazines with motions that were more ritual than necessity, because none of them would be firing from inside the helicopter unless the worst came, but those simple motions steadied their hearts, reminded them they were not passengers on this bird. They were warriors still, and if the sky itself wanted to tear them down they would answer with steel until the very last breath. Torres groaned, his head lolling for a moment before Maddox smacked his helmet lightly, barking his name, grounding him back to consciousness with a fury that was more love than anger, and the wounded SEAL's eyes focused again, bloodshot but alive, gripping Maddox's wrist with surprising strength, a silent promise that he wasn't letting go yet. The crew chief slid past them, face streaked with grime and sweat, shouting that the side gunners were burning through their last belts of ammo, that the hydraulics were whining in a way he didn't like, but the man's grin was feral, the grin of someone who knew they were pushing beyond every limit and loved the fight anyway. Then the night split open again. From the ridges behind, headlights flared like angry eyes, the roar of engines echoing off the stone as enemy technicals surged into pursuit, their mounted guns tilting upward to spit fire, tracers clawing at the sky with lethal beauty, and almost at the same moment another missile streaked upward from the shadows, a thin line of fire that painted the darkness with death. The pilot cursed, throwing the bird into a savage roll that hurled men against the bulkheads, the missile veering, correcting, closing fast, and the crew chief slammed the flare switch again, streaks of burning light tearing away from the Black Hawk, heat lures that confused the missile just long enough for it to arc harmlessly into the void where it detonated in a blast that lit the night like false dawn. But there was no time to celebrate because the trucks below were still firing, their tracers reaching higher with each burst, rounds slamming into the fuselage with metallic screams, one tearing through the floor to ricochet across the cabin, narrowly missing Maddox's shoulder before embedding in the opposite wall. The SEALs ducked instinctively but didn't panic, their discipline unshakable, their trust in the bird and each other absolute even as death clawed at them. The pilot shouted again, 2 clicks to the FOB, hold on, and the gunners leaned out the sides, unleashing their final belts in a fury of defiance, stitching the ground with arcs of fire that sent enemy trucks veering off the ridges, exploding in orange blossoms of flame, but for every vehicle destroyed another seemed to appear, headlights carving through the dust like hungry jaws. Maddox glanced at his men, reading their faces in the dim glow, seeing not fear but readiness, the kind of readiness that came when you had already accepted death and decided to fight anyway, and he felt pride surge hot in his chest, pride that he had the honor of leading them, pride that if this was their final ride, they would make it one the enemy would never forget. The bird shuddered violently as another round tore into the tail, alarms wailing, the co-pilot screaming about control loss, but the pilot wrestled the stick like a man possessed, muscles straining, voice steady even through the chaos as he promised he could hold it together, just a little longer, just enough. Then the night broke open in front of them with a new light, infrared strobes blinking faintly against the dirt below, the landing zone alive with the glow of salvation invisible to enemy eyes but burning like fire in theirs, and for the first time a cheer rose in the cabin, raw and ragged, because they could see home, they could see the finish, but the enemy wasn't finished with them, not yet. From the far ridge came the unmistakable trail of another missile, streaking upward with merciless intent, and the crew chief screamed warnings, hands slamming switches that spat the last of the flares into the night, glowing streaks that danced like decoys, but the missile didn't bite this time, it pressed forward, locked, hungering for the heat of their engines. Maddox didn't think, he moved, shoving the nearest man into cover as he yanked the last smoke grenade from his vest, yanking the pin and hurling it out the open side door, the thick plume blooming behind them, mixing with the flares in a chaotic mess that for one heartbeat seemed useless, until the missile veered at the last second, confused, plunging into the smoke and detonating short, the blast wave slamming into the Black Hawk with bone-jarring force, rattling teeth and loosening bolts, but not ending them. The landing zone rushed up beneath them, the ground crew sprinting with signal wands, the helicopter lurching as its damaged rotors strained to slow descent, every alarm in the cockpit howling at once, the frame groaning like a dying beast, but the pilot refused to surrender, muscles carved from sheer defiance as he forced the bird down, skids slamming into dirt so hard men inside were thrown to the deck, gears scattering, Torres screaming as pain flared through his wound, but they were down. They were down, and the FOB soldiers swarmed, rifles raised outward as they formed a wall of protection, shouting orders, dragging the SEALs out even as the Black Hawk's engines threatened to give their last breath. Maddox and his men spilled onto the dirt, still firing at shadows in the ridges, still ready for death, but then the wall of friendlies closed around them, and for the first time since the valley ambush began, the SEALs weren't alone. The Black Hawk's rotors finally slowed, the bird coughing smoke, wounded but not broken, and the crew clambered out, dragging gear, faces streaked with exhaustion but lit with the same fire that burned in the SEALs, the fire of men who had walked through hell and clawed their way out. Torres was rushed to a medic, his face pale but his grip on Maddox's hand still strong, refusing to let go until the corpsman swore he would live, and Maddox finally let himself collapse to one knee, dust rising around him, his chest heaving, the weight of survival crashing down in waves that threatened to crush him but never would, not while his brothers were still standing. Around him the SEALs gathered, silent, bloodied, their eyes on the broken helicopter that had saved them, their ears still ringing with the thunder of its blades, and though none spoke, they all felt the same truth. When the world had promised abandonment, when the radio had said air support was gone, when hope itself had withered, the Black Hawk had come anyway, and it had not only brought steel and fire but the one thing men needed most in the Valley of Death. It had brought them a way home. The end.